on him. His last name was Karnak. And I wasn't even saved at the time. I know there was a guy talking to me, the guy who actually got me in church, and we were going, we were having conversations. He invited me to church for about a year before I actually went. But during this time, I was friends with this other gentleman, and he knew that my other friend was trying to get me to come to church. And believe it or not, he made the statement. He's like, I'm never going to church. He's like, church is all messed up. You know what? I would let my child read a satanic Bible before I let him read a Bible. And I didn't throw that in, but I was thinking more about this guy and how his life had changed, because he went to this meeting with this organization called Amway. It existed back in the day. I don't know if it's still around. It's went through some versions. But anyway, it's a multi-level marketing thing. And I remember one day he came into work, and he started he was all pumped up, because I guess at these meetings they have, sales. If you've ever been to a sales meeting, yearly sales meeting, they really get you hyped up and all of that. But he came in and he started talking to me about, but if you're not giving a tithe, you got to give a tithe. I'm like, what's a tithe? And he explained it to me. He's like, this is something that we do. We, being the business he was in, is that you got to give a tenth of all your money to something that's worthwhile, charitable, because when you give, it comes back. I'm like, okay, and he calls it a tithe. And he was really big into this tithe. And so eventually I started going to church. After about a year, my friend never gave up on me. He wanted me to go to church, and I went. So, and I thank God he persisted. And so we went, and I see them take up the offering and the tithe. And eventually the conversation came up. He said I didn't have to give to that yet, because I didn't really understand what it was. But when he started explaining what the tithe was, like, oh yeah, this is what this guy's talking about, But the principle of God works. It's the principle of giving, and it's been established to where, and I don't even, I've heard it even to this day from some people that are my mentors that I consider that are influencers that say, if you can't give a tenth of $1,000, and they're talking about people that trying to get you wealthy. It says, if you can't give a tenth out of $1,000 now, how do you think you're going to be able to give, a tenth of $1,000,000 when you make that? So it's a principle, it works, and that's the short backstory on that.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Did I sum that up properly?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's your story, so you sum it up however you want. But it's crazy how, that you mentioned God's principles work, right? You do God's principles, whether it's, in the church, whether it's outside the church, but God's principles work. And your first experience with tithing, the tithe, that's funny. Hey, Pastor, I think we need to start calling it that, the tithe. The tithe. Make sure you give that tithe. No, but the fact that that was your first, encounter with this principle, and then you came to church and heard that, hey, this is God's people doing this. This is a godly principle. That's really interesting to me. And remind us how you came into the concept with tithing.
Well, I was a teenager when I came into church at 16, so I just listened to Bishop when he would preach, and I seen that the Word said to do it, so I was hooked. It was just that if this is what God said to do, this is what I'm going to do. And it was never a question in my mind whatsoever not to do it.
So your first experience was outside of the church. Your first experience was in the church, hearing it from the pulpit. Yep. And, maybe that's some people's experience here today. This is your first time hearing about, what tithing is. So it is a very godly principle. And last week we discussed that, the tithing is the first tenth, right? It's the tenth of your increase. And so you give the first 10%. That's for the priesthood. And then we also talked about giving, right? Tithing and giving being two separate things. Tithing is what you're required to give. The first 10% of your increase goes to the church. And then we also talked about what giving is as well. And you mentioned a standard 5% is a good thing to do, especially at the beginning, but then you also kind of evolved from that. But let's start off with the 5%, right? With the standard percentage of giving. So tell us why a percentage of giving is a good idea.
I think it is. It establishes how much you're going to give in your budget. You're already going to give a tenth, so if you decide to give a 5, you know what to budget. Like when I do our budget, the first thing, and I'm old school, I do it on paper, and I've done it like this for years, the very first thing says tithe. Next thing says offering. Next thing says mission. So I do it like that. And some people, maybe you're not at that point to where you can give 5%. Maybe, you're not making that much money, but you could have that as a goal to work your way up to it. I wanted to tell a quick little story. I remember I've been a part of New Life when it was Emmanuel Tabernacle, from the 80s. So I remember Bishop was preaching once when he was my pastor then about giving, because he was always giving his money to the church. He hardly took anything. I mean, Bishop back in the day. And I remember he was like, church, we've got to give because we can't keep the lights on and pay for whatever he did. So he was pleading to the church. Now, back in the day, I was making $3 to $5 an hour back in the day. That's like nothing. So he's like pleading with the church, you got to give, because he can't support himself and his family because they just don't have the money because people weren't giving. So I think I was making $5 an hour at the time. And this is how your heart should be. And I'm not saying this is because of me, but this is what I did. So I'm like, I got to give. And I was already paying my tithe and 5%. So I was giving 30% of my income out of $5 an hour, and I was making $100 a week. So then Bishop, which was pastor at the time, got wind of this through his dad, Brother Douglas Sr., and pastor had to come to me and say, or Bishop, you need to stop doing that, is what he did. Now, I thought my little $5 an hour and my little $30 a week was going to make a difference, but it was in my heart to give and to do what I could do, even though it wasn't that much. But I think that's what our heart needs to be. Give, and don't let your left and right hand know what you're doing.
And I mean, having a percentage is good for folks that need that type of organization. I guess I kind of live on the wire sometimes. I'm not as planned as she is, or organized or structured. I might have been that way at some point, but I try to be more sensitive to what God is trying to tell me to do. And there's been times to where I've had a certain amount of money in my wallet, and it was everything. And I just felt like I needed to give that, and I did, not knowing where the next thing was going to come from. But looking back, they say hindsight is 20/20. Knowing, and people that know me now see one picture, know us now, see one thing, but they don't know where we came from. And we went through a valley of very bleak, wasn't really hardly anything. And when you're giving and you don't have anything, it's like everything, and then some. But would I do it all over again? Absolutely, because I've seen the map and I've seen where it's taken us. I don't have all the answers, and I'm definitely not perfect. And I'm not saying that, oh, look at me and listen to everything I'm telling you. I'm just saying trust God. And the only way you can really prove that you trust God is not just saying it, oh, God, I love you. But when it comes time to separate with your finances, yeah, that's where it's really going to be proven. And that's what God said, test me and try me. He said that in the Word. And a lot of people miss that. And he's not just saying that for you to be arrogant. He's actually throwing it out there for you, right? So, like I said, having a number established, like a percentage, is good. But don't let that be the limitation. Don't let that be the limitation. Try to listen to what the Spirit is telling you and lead you. And sometimes it takes you out of your comfort zone. But really, if there's anything we've learned in the world and especially in church, is that greatness lies outside of the comfort zone, right?
It's really interesting that you said that. Like you mentioned, you mentioned you love Bishop, and you wanted to give. You had a heart for giving, And I think that goes back to, we kind of briefly mentioned it last week, but it kind of goes back to what Jesus mentioned. They said, well, what's the most important commandment? And he said, love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And again, how can we love our neighbor as we love ourselves if we're not willing to, be generous and give to our neighbor? And again, this is not just talking about now at this point, not just talking about just giving to the church, but just being generous in general, just loving, having that generous heart. And I'm not sure if you would have been willing to give 30% of your income if you didn't have that heart. Now, I'm not sure if you started out that way. If you started off with the concept of, hey, I'm just going to give 30%, did you gradually work up to that, or did you always?
No, it was only at that time when Bishop at the time, we were, like your dad said, I was the church secretary and your dad was the treasurer. So we knew what was coming in every single week, We knew, well, this was after the fact, let me just say that. But all I knew is that I wanted to do whatever we needed in the kingdom of God. And if it was cutting out something that I needed, I knew that God's work was more important. And he took care of me. He always did.
So you mentioned the standard percentage, right? And you also mentioned being generous, like that you love, Bishop, and that you wanted to give because you knew what was coming in, and you had that heart, almost like what Jesus talked about with the prodigal, not the prodigal, with the Good Samaritan. You know, I see there's a need, I'm going to give for that need. So you mentioned don't let your percentage be a limitation, right? And one of the things I'm just going to kind of throw out there as well. The idea of a standard percentage is good, especially at the elementary level of giving. If you're just now starting out giving, and you're like, okay, I don't really know what to give. I'm kind of like stuck here. Like I should be giving. I want to give something. A standard percentage helps because it starts getting you in the mindset of letting go of money, right? And even in the business world, there's this idea that you have to spend money to make money, right? I don't know if you guys have heard that, but there's an idea that you have to spend money to make money. The harder you try to hold on to money, the harder you try to hold on to it, the more that you're not going to have it, right? You'll have only what you have in your hand and never anything else, right? But when you start releasing it, especially when you start releasing it unto God, more can come back because you have an open hand. So you said that don't let a standard percentage be a limitation, and I absolutely agree with that. If you have a percentage, great. Let that be your bottom line. That's your floor. That's not the ceiling. That's your floor. That's where you start. And then from there, you mentioned being sensitive, right? Kind of going with it, whatever God wants you to give. So have the standard percentage of, or have the standard of, hey, I'm going to give this, and then whatever else God tells me to do is going to be extra on top of. Not that, oh nope, I gave my 5%. I'm good. Does that make sense? Is that kind of like where you guys are?
I mean, that's a good way to sum it up. You know, and I don't want to get too esoteric when it comes to mindset thinking, because this really comes into where a maturity takes place, where you start going from what I call a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset, and how to shift that thinking from always looking at what you can keep and how you can manage versus how you can give and how things flow through you. And I don't want to get too wooey with some concepts that people might associate with worldly things like law of attraction and all of that, because all that positive mindset stuff started in the Bible. Yeah. I mean, it all comes from the Bible. They just reworded it differently. And I know this because I've studied both concepts. So you go back to the original and say, oh, this was really in the Bible about the giving and it flowing back to you and being a channel for abundance. And it works. It just works. So that's the thing. You have to shift that way of thinking to really looking at it is that I have more to give because I have a source that is unlimited, right? So you stop looking at just trying to hold on, but just trying to let go and let it flow. Let go and let it flow.
I think this is a kind of a good way to segue into the next question anyways. So we've been talking about really a lot of what tithing is, but I really want to talk about for you two, why. Why is it so important? Why is tithing and giving so important for you two? And I'm going to let you answer that question first.
Right. So, you know, like I said before, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where the test is, because the world is run on economy. You look at it. Wars happen because of economies. Money is what runs the world. Jesus even said, you cannot serve God and money, okay? That's why it's so important, because this is where it establishes your relationship. It proves your trust in God. And you have to look at the kingdom as an economy, because really I have an uncle that takes more money than God will ever ask for. That's Uncle Sam. And he's taken money before I even have a chance to
I'm over here trying to figure out what uncle you're talking about.
Yeah, tell him what to do with it. And it's in the percentages that just makes me want to vomit sometimes when I see what's coming out. And they're doing whatever they want to with that money. I don't know what they're doing. It's definitely things I don't support or agree with. So I look at the kingdom as an economy to where I want to give to this kingdom because I believe in it, and I know where that money is going to go. And this is just proving that I'm putting my money where my mouth is, right? So it's not just about giving and thing. It's about supporting this kingdom to where if there's a fundraiser going on that's intended to benefit the church, I'm going to put my money there, even if it's going to cost a little bit more or maybe even a lot more than I would be able to pay for it at the dollar store. Like if there's a fundraiser and they're selling candy or something to benefit the youth, I'm going to put my money there first before I go to the dollar store and buy it cheaper, because I know where that's going. They're selling coffee, they're selling donuts. I know that's going for a good cause. Is it more expensive than I could buy it for? Yeah, but I know where that's going, and I am supporting the economy of this kingdom. I want to support God's mission, right? And I'm selling beef jerky next week for the youth. So just a little
nice little plug in there.
Yeah, it's to take all the youth to NAYC. It'll bless them spiritually. But anyway, I digress.
Let me say
But
one thing. I can guarantee you that he did not say all that just to let you know about the beef jerky.
no,
He's
but
lived this.
it came to mind. And this is what I believe is that if you see something going on, you want to support this kingdom. You want to be this to be your economy where you invest in to further expand it because they're taking your money first before God even has his. So as much as you can sow into the kingdom, you should because really that's the bigger picture. That's what really matters. That's eternity. And it's establishing with God where your intentions really are.
You know what I love about that answer? And it's so genuine, and you can hear it in your voice how genuine it is. But, you know, when you hear people think about this concept of tithing and giving, right, oftentimes the first thing that you'll hear is, you know, well, I know I'll give God, or I know that it'll be returned to me. But in your whole spiel there, I didn't hear anything about what you can gain out of it, right? It was
and you've seen this, right? Because
Yes.
you've seen me live this life. And it's not like I'm just saying to do something that I don't do. This is something that I believe in, and I'm going to let my example demonstrate that.
I'll ditto that.
Oh, you're just going to ditto that?
I'll ditto that.
Okay. All right. Well, no, I have seen that. I've seen that my whole life, and I think that principle has kind of jumped onto me because of you. Sometimes it's really annoying because I don't expect money back from my friends when when I give money out. But you know, there is this mindset of like, no, when you give it, let it go. It's not about what you can get back from it, right? Now there is the principle we read at the beginning. There is the principle God says, I'm not going to be a debtor. I'm not going to be indebted to you. There's so many scriptures about money, and God's not going to be indebted to us. It will be returned to us. As far as, you know, whether it's monetary, whether it's, you know, just overall, you know, life, it will be returned to us. But that's not the purpose of why we give. That's not why we do it. We do it what you just mentioned, you know, because it's supporting the kingdom.
Yeah. And that, I mean, I don't know how much I can re-emphasize this because, you know, if you look at the biblical example of people that were, and there's one example of someone who was always interested where money was going and what was going on with it and is it being used, and that person betrayed Jesus, right?
Judas.
And if you trust God and you give, you trust God to let it happen. And God is the ultimate one who is going to bring judgment or whatever needs to be done if things aren't being done right. And so it's either you trust God and let God manage, or you get involved because you don't trust God and you want to micromanage, right? So that is a place I think where everybody has to come to at some point, and you have to cross that bridge. You really do, because until you get there and you start letting things flow through you instead of trying to hold on to as much as you can, then I think you are limiting yourself. And I think that's the best way I could really say it is that if you don't cross that bridge, it's not really, you really are limiting yourself, and you're kind of keeping God at a distance from really doing what he wants to do with you, to flow through you and demonstrate how much of a source of abundance he really is to further expand the kingdom.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, there's that concept of it's not about what I can get from it, but it's about what I can give, you know? And it's not always easy. I know I've heard stories about when I was a kid, you know? People see where, you mentioned already, people see where, you know, you are as a family, we are as a family now, and they don't really understand where you guys came from. And, you know, there have been challenges at time with tithing and giving. Can you guys tell us about some of those challenges and how you overcame them?
Well, I don't think there's ever been any challenges with paying tithing. Let's just get that straight from the beginning, because I wouldn't eat if
So it wasn't an option.
There's been a principle that's always been established in our home that we were always going to pay our tithing. That would be like you saying, I can't live in a house, I got to pay my mortgage first, where that's the top of our list. Our tithing is paid first. But we have had many challenges since we've been married to where we didn't know how we were going to make the money. Like when we lived in our home and we were having renters rent, they couldn't pay the rent. We drained all of our savings to keep the house afloat. And I threw my hands up at God, not mad at him, but like, God, I'm trying to do everything I can not to help this house to go under that we were renting. and I don't want to be a burden on the economy. So, God, I don't know what else to do. And I just threw my hands up at God and said, I've been faithful. I've done everything right. So I'm just going to let the system take the house because we can't pay it. I'm telling you, within the week, I don't know where God brought this person from, but this person just decided they wanted to come and rent the house and was a faithful tenant for 2 years. But we had completely drained everything that we had and really was living paycheck to paycheck. And this was only like 10 years ago, I think it was. But how God just did everything. And I was like, God, you're faithful, but I can't do any more. And he stepped right in at 11:59 and 59 seconds.
And I think that's a really good example of, I've said this in, I think, First Things before, but when you're in a good place, you don't break the system that got you there, right? And I know, and I'm sure I know some of the stories you might tell, but I know the system that you guys have had your entire life. Tithing first. You mentioned it, tithing first. And that's been a principle since, you had literally, like $5 in the savings account? That's been a principle from then all the way $0 in the bank account. That's been a principle since $0 to where you did have 2 homes and you were able to rent one out. And even then, you're like, instead of saving this house that, we have, I'm going to pay my tithing first. And if this thing has to get foreclosed on, it gets foreclosed on, whatever. But God came first. So what about you?
Well, in the beginning.
So we're going way back.
In the beginning, once you jump in with both feet, you have to make a decision, right? You burn the bridges, you're not looking back, and you say, I have to go forward full speed because if this is real and there is an eternity, then I'm going to make sure that I'm part of that. And there was a lot of resistance. I have a whole other life, and there was a lot of resistance, and there was some battles. I've had lights turned off. I've literally lost home. I've lost things in my first 2 years. And I was telling God, God, I'm doing what I think I know to do. I'm trusting you, but things are not getting better. In fact, they've gotten a lot worse. But do I really believe this, right? And that's where I say this is where the rubber meets the road. So you make that decision based on looking at everything going wrong in your life and say, no, God, I'm going to trust you no matter what. I'm going to give my tithe faithfully because I know this is what's expected of me, and I know that somewhere, somehow, something's going to work out. And sure enough, it took a few years, but, things flipped to 180. But at that time, the temptation to not pay tithe was not as great as the not following through on what I knew God wanted me to do.
So you were committed to paying tithes more than...
Once you know this is real, and that's what I'm saying, is once you know and you believe this, there's really no other choice, right? There really is no other choice. You can't live with 1 foot in the world, when the unsaved, lost world, and then 1 foot in the kingdom of God and try to live the best of both lives. You can, that's going to get you hit by a truck when you walk in the middle of the street. So, unless you can really walk that tightrope. Right. So once you know and once you believe, and if you really believe, you're going to do.
What's really interesting is you mentioned the lights turning off. And I've heard that story, but I've heard it from the other side, right? I remember my birth mom, when I would go over and visit her. I remember one time she was complaining about, like the church. And, for those who may not know, my birth mom, she was not a big fan of the church at all. And she was telling me one time, she was like, yeah, your dad one time, when you were kids, it was literally a choice between paying the power bill or giving to the church or paying his tithing. He chose to pay his tithing and turn the lights off, So that when he says that's a true story. I heard that. The funny thing is, like, as a young kid, I'm hearing that from my mom, and I'm like, okay, but there's still this principle of giving. So you're just telling me that my dad's committed. Like, that's what I'm hearing. Like, you're telling me my dad's committed. And I think I talked to you about that one time, and you said I had to make that decision one time, and I never had to make that decision again because God came through for me. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, once God brings you to places it's kind of like that Abraham moment, not as drastic where God telling Abraham, I want you to go and sacrifice your only son. I can't even imagine that. And God don't even listen to what I'm saying. So that's one of those times where, you're either going to show me, do you really believe this or not? And like you said, I had to make that decision one time, and once you make it, it's easier the next time. You know, and it's like, okay, just gonna keep doing it. And it gets to the point where I say, God, I'm gonna do what you want me to do, even if it kills me. Because I know on the back end that there's an eternity. And I really believe this, God. So I'm going to prove that I believe this, and that I'm not doing all this in vain, because I trust you. And this is how I'm showing you that I trust you. And hindsight is 2020. Looking back, would I go through it again? Yeah, obviously. I mean, do you think I should go through it again?
I mean, 30 years later, you're in a pretty good spot, and I think
you've seen
yes.
me live this life.
Yes.
You know.
I've seen it, and the interesting thing is I've seen it every step of the way. It's never been, and this is something that's been continuous with both of you. It's never been, look at where I've come, look at where I am now, look at how I got here. It's always been, this is where God brought us. Like, God just opened this door, He opened this door, and the answer has always been because we've been faithful. Because we've been faithful in our tithing and offering, because we've been faithful in our giving, and it's always been this overshadowing principle in our family that because God can trust you with finances, He has given you more. And you see that in Scripture, right? You see that the story of the talents. He gave one guy 5, He doubled it. So He gave the guy 2, He doubled it. He gave the guy 1, the guy that had 1 just buried in the sand. God took it away and gave it back to the one who doubled 5, right? So there's the idea that if you just give to God, if you do the work and give to God and trust God with it, He's going to return it unto you. But it becomes more than Him returning it unto you. And that's kind of where I see where you guys are now. It's more than, He's going to return it to me. Now it's, I'm blessing the kingdom. I'm doing what I can for the kingdom. And if I don't get anything in return, I don't get anything in return. I'm just going to give, And I think that comes from a spirit of gratitude.
And that's one thing I was going to throw in there. And I think that's the wild card, because your attitude of giving is so important. I hate to use the word has to be good. It really should be a cheerfulness. I'm happy to give this to you, God. Not like, God, here we go again. I just got to give you this money. And I could really be doing other things with it, or being, just holding on to that money as you're giving it. You're like, freely give, Freely we've received salvation from Jesus Christ while we were yet sinners, right? So we should be happy to give. And when you give with that attitude, an attitude of thanksgiving, thankfulness, and gratitude, I think that's what makes the difference. And that's what I believe.
Well, I was going to say, we've been doing the Sacrifice Sunday thing. So maybe like 3 years ago, and we come up with a number or whatever, but I'm not going there, but sometimes you might feel like you're already given a lot, right? You do. So one year I was like, Jesus, I'm giving a lot already. So I'm like, I get a certain amount of money for myself, and then my husband, because I'm a stay-at-home mom and stuff. But I was like, I'm just going to let my husband give this year. Now, I didn't even take any time to ask God how He felt about this. I just told God what I was going to do. And this was like 2 or 3 years ago. And then I got a check in my spirit, and God was like, and I was like, God, you know what? I am so sorry. And I repented of that, because I felt like I had already been given enough. And this was probably the one and only time, but I got a check in my spirit from God, because He gave everything so we could have something. So money is just something you're going to have today. It's going to be gone, and you can't take it with you. But God gave me a check in my spirit, and you know what? God blessed me with some money, and I gave every penny of it to Him, because I wasn't going to withhold anything. And I repented for having that attitude. And in return, God just takes care of me again. But I had to have a check in my spirit, because I'm like, I'm already giving God. And God was like, pfft. And I did. So I had to repent of that. Never think you're out giving and giving too much. Never think that.
And it just goes to show that no matter how long you've been in it, even how consistent you've been with that system, sometimes those thoughts can come. Like, I think I'm good. I think I'm good.
Because I want to buy something for myself, Lord. Mm-hmm. I don't want to buy air conditioning. I want to buy myself. But
that's when that small voice whispers.
Yeah.
Hey, wait a minute. Hold on.
Yeah.
Who gave you that money, right?
Right.
So, but yeah, actually, that kind of leads me to my next question, though. You mentioned your finances. So when you guys come, like, so, and when you start talking about giving, right? Okay, and when we do sacrifice giving, sacrificial giving, those types of things, and you're giving together as a family. So this is more of a question like for family units, and we're running out of time here, so let's kind of like do this one a little bit quicker, because I do have one more question I want to get to, and then I think there's a submission as well. If you guys are disagreeing on a number, right? How do you guys like make a compromise on that? Like, if let's say you have a number in mind that I want to give $2,000, and then he comes back and is like, well, I thought we should give like $3,000. How do you guys reconcile that?
We always go with the highest number. That's it.
Easy. That's easy.
That's it.
Okay.
If I came with 2 and he came with 3, we just go with 3. We go with the highest number.
Okay, so easy enough. Just go with a higher number. All right. That's kind of like what we do as well, like me and Kate as well. Usually, like if I say a number and she says a number and one of them is higher, we just go with the higher one, because I don't know if that's like self-preservation as far as like, all right, God, I'm not going to be selfish and you're not going to strike me down like Ananias and Sapphira, like, or if that's just like, no, let me not be tight with my finances, or maybe God is challenging. I guess like one way I take it is, if Kate brings a higher number than I have, maybe God is challenging me to see, this is not what you felt, but are you submitted enough to me to be willing to give more than you thought? Right. And that's kind of like the way I take it whenever something like that happens. Or if I have a number in mind and something else comes, like maybe I should give more, okay. And like a second thought comes through. Maybe that's God speaking to me. All right, I'll go ahead and give just a little bit more, because I want to be that type of person. Like I've seen you be my entire life, that no, I genuinely trust God with my finances. I genuinely trust him with my money. And, you guys have been incredible examples of that, of trusting God. So it makes me want to be more so like that. And I hope one day, my 2 little boys, Elliot and Levi, I hope that I can be an example enough that they see it and that principle catches on to them. So kind of like wrapping everything up, right? What advice would you give to someone who is struggling to give, right? Who is, let's just say, like, they don't make a whole lot of money. They're struggling to make ends meet. And they're still struggling with the concept of tithing and, is it necessary for today, those different types of things. What do you say to that person?
You want me to say something first?
Yes. Go ahead, Mom.
Well, with many times that I've mentored and talked to people, when I sit down to talk with them, pretty much within the first 10 or 15 minutes, I always ask them, are you paying your tithing? A lot of times they'll tell me no, and then I tell them you cannot afford not to pay your tithing, because you have closed God's hands from blessing you. And just like he keeps saying it, it's where the rubber meets the road. And like he had the lights cut off, you might not have this or that, but God will make a way if you trust him and you try him. What did the word of God say? Try me. And don't steal from God. And I always tell him, this is something you have to do. It is. This is what Scripture says. But if you will put God to the test and you would do what needs to be done, he will always, maybe not in the beginning, you might not see any fruit from it, but if you do it with a cheerful heart and not grudgingly, he will always come through.
Right. So, and I keep saying this, as far as you're going to get to that place where you have to make that decision. And obviously, it's a big adjustment. I mean, when you first come into this understanding of this concept, that's a big shift. All of a sudden, 10, 15% of your finances has to be shifted that you might not even have. But, the government does a good job of deficit spending what they don't have. That's why we have this $1 trillion debt ceiling. And so I'm saying if they could do it, I could do it too. And I've had to do that, spend what I don't have and just hope that it comes from somewhere. So I can say from, having lived it, just do it and trust God and see what happens, and do it with a good attitude. You won't be disappointed. It's not going to be easy. I'm going to tell you. It might not be easy, but it will be worth it, and it will work out on your behalf in the long run. And, when you start out, you start doing things because you understand that this is something that you have to do. But as you mature and you get bigger, you understand that this is a kingdom that you really want to expand, because we were just like everybody else, not saved. But it took someone reaching out and bringing you into that place. And, look at investing into the kingdom, because there's a lot of people out there that's not saved, and you want them to become part of this kingdom, and you want the kingdom to expand so that those that don't know can know and hear this gospel that we believe. And the only way that's going to happen is if you trust God with your finances and we grow, because Jesus said you can't serve God and you can't serve money. And he said that for a reason, right? There's a principle that says, seek God first and his kingdom, and everything else. That's in Matthew. I think it's 6. You're right. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and everything else will be given to you. So that's the principle there. And if that means that you have to put God first with your money, just do it and see what happens.
And I kind of want to circle back to what we mentioned a minute ago, right? Because everything we're saying is really important, trusting God. But when you really start talking about this mindset of giving, right, you're giving to God. You talked about it earlier, the economy of the kingdom, right? Again, if you start getting into this mindset, and Sister Allison actually made a really good comment as well. You mentioned it earlier. If we're starting to question where the money's going, you start to question, hey, what are you spending this money on? What is that money getting spent on? You start walking in like the mindset of Judas, who was the betrayer of Christ. Right. Now, I'm not saying that if you can never wonder, hey, what is happening with that money, but check yourself first. If you're starting to really wonder, hey, what's going on with the money? What's going on with this? What's going on with that? Check yourself first. Why am I asking this question? Am I actually concerned with, is the money going to a good cause, or am I just like trying to justify not giving anymore? Sorry, go ahead.
Let me say one thing. The Bible does warn about those that will abuse this process here.
It does.
It does warn about those that seek and take money for themselves while promoting a kingdom, but really not doing that. And if you ever go into a church, just seek God and say, look, if they're not transparent with the money and they're not open, then that's a problem. And it's a good thing we have a church and a pastor that's very open, very transparent. And that's really the first test you want to do is, see God and see how that pastor is lining up. And I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for. We did have one more post. It says maybe the higher number is talking about, like, if you have two separate numbers. Maybe the higher number is the person with the greater faith, trusting that the other has got the heart of God. So that's really good. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I hope you guys enjoyed our talk on tithing and giving. That wraps up our 2-week session. Next week, Brother Gwendu is going to be heading off. He's going to be facilitating next week, and we're going to be talking about stewardship, the stewardship of finances. So not just from a tithing and giving standpoint. We spent 2 weeks on that, so we're not going to talk too much about tithing and giving anymore. But it's going to be more so about managing finances, how to be a good steward of your finances. We got some pretty financially savvy people on that panel, so you don't want to miss it. If you ever have any questions about how to be a good steward of finances in general, these 3 people I think will help you out a lot with that. So thanks for being here. Thanks for being here on this beautiful Sunday morning and not out golfing. And we hope to see you in the next session. We're going to be starting here in about in 10 minutes. Come on back at 11:55. We're going to start creating the atmosphere of worship. And then at 12 o'clock, we're going to